evening, everybody, and thanks so much for coming along. Great to see so many familiar faces as well, and a few new faces. So, O'Tunney, a name, as soon as I arrived in Kilkenny many years ago, was one of the first names I heard before I even heard local names, was Rory O'Tunney. O'Tunney generally, and then there's Rory O'Tunney. Now, we all have heard the name O'Tunney, I presume, and that's why we're here tonight. But what do we know about Rory O'Tunney, or the O'Tunneys generally? Well, I'm going to talk specifically about Rory O'Tunney, because there are other O'Tunneys, but that's for another night, another discussion. I will touch on them very briefly. And this actually turns out to be a massive subject. It's almost too big to talk about in one sitting like tonight. But I'm going to do my best. And I should point out, it's also very much a work in progress. I've spent a few years now looking at some of O'Tunney's material. And when I say O'Tunney, I mean Rory specifically. And when I started it, everything was in. I was looking at everything and counting everything in. And you kind of, at the beginning, before your eyes really clued in, you start to see everything is a Rory O'Tunney. And you realize he couldn't have done everything. And it takes actually years to get the eye in, to actually distinguish his handiwork from another stonemason's handiwork or sculptor's handiwork. And this is still an ongoing process. And just when you think you've kind of nailed it, something else comes in, you kind of go, it's like Lanigan's ball, you're stepping in, you think you're getting closer, then you have to step back again. And that's actually the way, particularly with looking at buildings in archaeology, is that you have to get up really close and then stand back and look at it from a distance. And sometimes you have to look at it from a great distance. I don't mean just stand back in the field and have a look at it. I mean, you might actually have to go to another county or the other end of the country to appreciate it. Or even outside the country, for some examples. Anyway, that's a whole discussion for another night. But I'm going to actually just step back to my own County Wicklow briefly. And this is a headstone in Glendalough. It's from the 18th century, and it's carved by a chap called Dennis Cullen. And his address, he actually gives himself as Dennis Cullen, stonecutter, Monaseed, which is in North County Wexford. In a couple of other examples, he not just gives his address, but he also gives us stonecutter and sculptor. And so he's giving us his name, his profession, and his address. And even in the 18th century, this is quite rare. To see this in the 16th century is extremely rare. And this is why we have a unique opportunity with Rory O'Tunney especially to get close to one of the best stone carvers and I think builders, master builders in the country. I'm not saying he's the best, that he's the most prolific or the most adventurous or anything like that, but he's certainly one of the few that we can put a name to. And I'll come back to that, what the meaning of that is later. But there's a few comparisons here with Dennis Cullen. For example, even the idea of putting your name, telling the world that I'm the person responsible for this, is one of those interesting comparisons with Dennis Cullen, for example. He was actually the first person to sign his headstone in the kind of North Wexford area. Dennis Cullen's fame spread so far that his headstones end up not just in North County Wexford, but all the way down in New Ross, into Hackettstown and Carlow, up into Glendalough, as far as Kilcooley and Wicklow. There's even one example in Rush in North County Dublin. That's a long way away from North County Wexford. And that's before trains, canals, anything like that. It probably made its way by sea. But similar transport issues, if you like, to what it would have been in the 16th century. Albeit the roads may have been slightly better and slightly better bridges and things like that in the 18th century than they were in the 16th century. But actually transport links had not improved very much. And you can see here a man whose carvings are so appreciated that they travel a long distance. And actually, you can see something similar with Rory O'Tunney as well. Now, when I started looking, step back a little bit. Dennis Cullen was quite well known. People like Ada Longfield, who'd been married to Harold Least, for example, who some of you may recognise that name in terms of medieval architecture in Kilkenny, had looked at his material, these carvings back in the 50s. More recently, our late colleague Owen Grogan, who passed away just before Christmas, had been looking at these as well. And having travelled through all the graveyards, and possibly because it's a bit handier for me living in the area, seeing them, I realised actually that there was a lot more headstones that people had really appreciated. In fact, we could treble the number what we had expected. This guy's output was phenomenal for the time. He had fancy ones. He also had the kind of what I'd call the Little and Aldi version. If you didn't have as much money, he could mass produce these as well for people. And that was fine. So it turns out, actually, he had a huge output of carvings in his lifetime. Now, interestingly, if we look at Rory O'Tunney, we're talking about a period when, if you read some of the literature to date, they talk about a period from about 1501 to about 1551 or 52, a 50-year period. There's no way on earth Rory O'Tunney was working over a 50-year period. He may have been alive for a 50-year period, but his career did not last 50 years. 35 would be an absolute maximum, I would think, for this period. Dennis Cullen, we can see his headstones with a huge date range as well. But I can tell you now, I'm just giving you a short version of the history and biography of Dennis Cullen. He was working really from about 1755 to about 1780. But some of his headstones actually go back even further than that. And that's one of the issues that you have with burial monuments of all periods, is that they can fool you. The dates on monuments like this will fool you into thinking that it might be earlier than it actually is. And that's one of the things we have to be careful with. Now, there's a big difference between a headstone like this sitting out in a graveyard and some of Rory O'Tunney's monuments, which are actually designed to be sitting inside a church. They actually have a completely different function, in fact, as altars. And those altars could be, they're probably commissioned for a chantry chapel in a given church. They're designed as an altar. They could be commissioned years before somebody dies, in fact, unlike these headstones, which are rarely, if ever, commissioned before somebody's died. It's usually long after. But in the case of some of these Rory O'Tunney monuments and those type of monuments of that period, they're invoking people to a prayer to the family who were commemorated on this tomb. Well, you might as well get those prayers in early when that person is still alive, even better, not just after they've died. So some of those monuments could, in fact, predate the decease of the individuals commemorated. So they become extremely complicated to try and understand. A headstone, it's generally one stone in a graveyard. It can be moved. It doesn't really matter too much. But when it comes to composite monuments like these tombs, they have a mensa on the top or an altar on the top. They have side panels. They're composite pieces that can be dismantled, reassembled incorrectly, moved all over the place. They could even be moved potentially from one church to another over the centuries. And I have a suspicion about one tomb in particular that may have been moved from somewhere else to somewhere more close to where we're sitting today. So there are more than subtle differences between looking at headstones like this in the countryside of Wicklow and Wexford to looking at burial monuments that are part of churches and medieval churches that are still standing today. But one of the interesting things, and I don't think this has really been considered when we look at Rory O'Tunney, is that we tend to think of this man's output as a point in time. We're looking for comparisons of something similar to something, not allowing for the fact that this is probably a man who is honing his skill. It's not something that's static. He's not just carving the same thing. He's somebody who's very, very skilled. He's thinking, well, how can I make this one slightly different to the last time I did it? So you're never going to get exact comparisons when you look at some of the sculpture. It would be nice if they were. It would make our job, and my job in particular, a lot easier. But that's not the way it works. And also, if you look at somebody like Dennis Cullen, who I think is a good comparison for this, here's a man who starts off, believe it or not, if you look at this one of the later examples, he doesn't just sign it, he actually gives us signature motifs like this man on a horse, the church. These are motifs that he's introduced himself as a signature motif as well as his own signature. This is towards the end of his career. If we look somewhere in the middle of his career, this is what it looks like. Very different. If we look at something even before that, it's very different. If we look at something at the start of his career in the 1750s, and this one actually is commemorated to a Dennis Cullen who died in 1733. This headstone was not carved in 1733, it was carved in the 1750s. This is a man at the beginning of his career. That's what it looks like. and you would have no idea. And took me years to figure out and trace the exact changes, the kind of evolution of his script, for example, and the style of carving to finally kind of show a pattern that links the beginning to the end and bookmark his career. Do we have something similar with Rory O'Tunney? Because he is probably somebody who has to start somewhere, and he's not going to start his career as a master sculptor. I'm presuming he has to hone that craft to some of the things that stand out, jump out at us today. So where is the beginning of his career? I don't know, to be honest with you, but a few little hints. Interestingly, Dennis Cullen, who carved about 300 headstones in his life, doesn't have a headstone commemorating him. He commemorated lots of people on headstones, but there's not a single headstone carved to him. I have a funny feeling that his son, who's also Dennis Cullen, actually used it. I have a sneaking suspicion I know where the headstone is. It's in Glendalough, and I think his son used it and sold it on to somebody else. That's my own personal opinion of it. But it's very difficult to prove. And interestingly, we don't know where Rory O'Tunney is buried. That's the reason why I comment on that. Now, another interesting feature here as well, when it comes to Dennis Cullen, believe it or not, is his interest in architecture. You can see that in terms of the church motif that we see here. It's clearly designed on what would have been quite a typical, maybe Church of Ireland parish church in a rural area of North Wexford, South Wicklow, somewhere like that, in the kind of mid to late 18th century. But also this panel here, which is not from a headstone, it's something else. I'm not entirely sure what it was designed for. It's sitting in a picture frame today, but it may have been designed as a piece or part of a bigger piece of furniture, for example. I don't really know what this was originally intended for. It's a house in Wexford, believe it or not, and you can see the owner of the house here on his trap. This was not a headstone. So Dennis Cullen is actually interested in architecture, and he's also sculpting things that are not headstones. And we're just getting a glimpse of this. I have a funny feeling he's somebody who's involved when headstone trade is not doing so well. He'll probably be out there on a building site doing something somewhere. And I can't trace him. It's just impossible to trace him on a building site. And it may have something to do with the types of buildings and the type of stone, etc. I don't know. But when it comes to Rory O'Tunney, I think we can find his fingerprints all over buildings in this area. And that's one of the things I want to talk on. My opening slide there was Kilcooley Abbey. I know I should have used the Kilkenny example for the setting tonight, but so I hope you'll forgive me. But the story actually starts in Kilcooley as well, because you alluded to it on this particular headstone to one of the Cantwells. His name is carved here in a very prominent position on the shaft of the cross, and he names his father Patrick. Now, how common a name is O'Tunney in this part of the world, really? We don't know very much about O'Tunney. I don't have any particular insights to offer tonight as to where he might, where is his origin story. But I'm pretty sure it's not in Kilkenny, to be perfectly honest. And I suspect very strongly that he actually comes from Ulster. And there are other reasons for thinking that, and some of those, believe it or not, are architectural. But I need to explore that a bit more before I can confirm it. So maybe just keep that to yourselves, and whoever's on YouTube, you can keep that to yourself for the moment. But here we see a classic example of a tomb that has been put together incorrectly. It probably incorporates at least two different monuments. So we've got the mensa here, the altar commemorating the Cantwells. We've got this frontal here and this end piece, which I think was intended actually to sit the other way for various reasons. We've got St. James the Major, St. Andrew and St. Peter. I think if we were looking at this, he would be in a more prominent position, not tucked in the corner against the wall. And it's when you kind of look at this in the kind of minutiae that you start to think, actually, that doesn't make sense, because that's in the wrong place. It could only work if it's here, because it's meant to be seen and it's meant to be read from a particular way. So it's an interesting way to look at tombs that have been dismantled and put together wrong. And this is an example of it. In fact, most of them are, including the Butler tomb across on the other side of the chancel from it. which has also been put together wrong. So this is one of the ends that has been switched around, and this is the frontal here. We've got our Butler knight here, and Rory has very conveniently signed this for us as well. So I'm starting with what we know, and it's always important to start with what you know and work out from that, rather than the other way around. I think one of the things I noticed a lot in the last few years working in Kilkenny and surrounding areas is that people will say, oh yeah, that's an O'Tunney monument or that's an O'Tunney carving, without actually knowing necessarily what that means. And sometimes I'm pretty sure things get called O'Tunney that are not O'Tunney. And it's important to differentiate between what is O'Tunney and what isn't, because there's somebody else involved in that. And, you know, if we put it in the wrong category, then we're misunderstanding it. I'm not saying that they're not related in some way, they might be. But when we focus down on Rory O'Tunney and see what he is responsible for, as we'll see later, it would be interesting if we could do that for other stonecutters as well, even if we don't have a name for them. Another Cantwell monument also signed by Rory O'Tunney at Kilcooley as well. And moving now slightly closer to home, of course, we've got the Walsh tomb in Jerpoint Abbey, which has a number of carvings, again, very conveniently carved at the stem of the cross. His signature gets quite a prominent position here. Here we're looking at a couple of the ends of it, one of the front panels and a crucifixion at the end. Currently in the National Museum, I think it made its way through the original Kilkenny Museum that was here, or not here, but in Kilkenny before it moved to Dublin. And this is reputedly actually from St. Francis's across the road, also signed as well. But as you can see, it's very, very partial. It kind of makes me wonder, what else are we missing from St. Francis's? And there's actually a small piece as well that's reputedly from the Black Abbey. So what else are we missing from the Black Abbey when we see some of the more complete examples, such as this one from St. Canice's, which is the Grace tomb, and John Grace, and also commemorating his wife. We'll come back to that because actually both names appear when we look at another site not too far away from us as well. But this is a very interesting tomb for it's slightly more complete than what we've had. The effigy, unfortunately, a bit disfigured, obviously. We have his signature here, which actually appears on this end here, just above the crucifixion. You can see it there, but that's a detail of it. The Grace line here, and then the usual frontal with the main saints. But in fact, this was originally a four-sided tomb. So today it's actually placed up against the wall. So you have the frontal and you have the two ends. But originally it's a four-sided tomb. And another Grace effigy to a later Northern Grace. As you come into the reception area on the left, it's just under the window you can see there. This frontal almost certainly belongs to that tomb, to the Grace tomb. But it's been placed here under this tomb. At some point, I don't know exactly when that was done, whether it was done in the 19th century when there was a lot of movement of monuments around St. Canice's, or whether it's even an earlier rendition of something. It's hard to say. So if this is the front of it that was meant to be seen, this would be on the opposite side of our knight. And given that this is the Grace tomb here. That's the watch. It's just looking at the saints. They're not repeated. It's exactly the same type of. Anyway, it's definitely without doubt. And Edward already even suggested before me. I'm not suggesting it for the first time that this was from the same tomb. So originally, it's a four-sided tomb. And then we get things moved around. And it's interesting to see both Ormond and Cantwell. We've seen Butler and Cantwell's in Kilcooley Abbey appearing again here in St. Canice's. This is Piers Butler's tomb, but it doesn't really belong to that tomb at all. And it's forming one side of the tomb. And in fact, there's another piece. Well, I'll come back to that other piece later. There's another piece of an O'Tunney carving incorporated into this tomb as well. I do wonder, I mean, this is a Butler Fitzgerald tomb, so it has nothing to do with Ormond and Cantwell, as you see on this. So that Piers Butler tomb has been reconfigured at some point in the 19th century, and unfortunately, I suspect they probably didn't know what parts belonged to what anyway, so they just used what was convenient. But it means you can see that there's multiple O'Tunney carvings at St. Canice's, but none of them are complete. And it's like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle to say what goes with what. In terms of the Grace Monument or the Grace Tomb, we are very confident about what it should look like. Although I do have a question mark if we're missing an effigy of a lady there. But anyway, Jerpoint. Back to Jerpoint, we've seen the Walsh tomb, and we also have the O'Houlihan tomb, the harper here with the harp on his side. He's got a tuning peg here. Unfortunately, his head is missing, and even more of his wife is missing here too. It's for a long time it was associated with this carving, but it may not actually have anything to do with that. The name is there. It's not signed by O'Tunney, but I'm absolutely certain this is O'Tunney. And these carvings are also O'Tunney, but whether they belong to this effigy or not is a different matter. And we have the same problem with this other very fine carving, which is also Rory O'Tunney, although it's not signed, but it's definitely Rory O'Tunney. But what does this belong to? We don't have an effigy to match it with. Both of these, I think this was always intended to be, unlike the Grace one, which I just talked about, which will be four-sided, this one was probably only ever two-sided, or maybe three-sided, but certainly two-sided. And that's because of the figures here, who would normally appear on the main panel if it was to be seen. But because it's appearing on the end panel, it's definitely designed to be built against the wall. It's how you read the figures, which is important here. In fact, one of the most complete O'Tunney carvings or sculptures, tombs, is this one in St. John's here in Kilkenny. And it seems to be inserted into an earlier Easter sepulchre on the north side of the chancel, and may have continued in use as such actually as well. And this is the Purcell monument. Now, some people have raised questions about this, and including Edwin Ray. He kind of did put the question mark, is this really Rory O'Tunney? Because the carvings here, if you look at the quality, they're a lot simpler, kind of not quite as three-dimensional, quite as well formed as compared to these figures. It's hard to believe, in fact, that these might even be by the same person. But I think the giveaway here, in fact, is the crucifixion, which I've no doubt is O'Tunney, and I think everything else is. I think this is an example of one of his early works, where he's still at that stage where he hasn't quite mastered figure sculpture yet. He's well on the way. I mean, these are quite well-formed figures, but they're not nearly as well-formed as some of his later carvings. And that's my personal reading of this particular monument. Going to the Rock of Cashel and the Cathedral, in one of the transepts there, we have this particular one to an Orion, or Ryan would be the local name, obviously, in that part of Tipperary. We have a partial crucifixion figure here, and more of a cross on the altar itself of the Mensa, and not an effigy. And if we only think of O'Tunney in terms of effigies, then we're missing more than half of the tombs that he created. A lot of his tombs don't have effigies at all. They have comparatively simple crosses on them. But they often do feature figure sculpture on the sides. But then if this was designed to sit on the floor of a church, and many of them were, they were never designed to be full upstanding monuments that might serve as an altar, then you might get something as simple as this without any figure sculpture at all. Would you recognize this as an O'Tunney carving if it wasn't signed, if it was well worn by, a few centuries of feet walking over it? Would it be as obvious as being O'Tunney? Probably not. So I think there are a lot more carvings like this that have yet to be recognized as his work. And then returning back to St. Canice's, we have this particular curious tomb, or fragments of various fragments of tombs, some of which are now in the National Museum. Then we have this end panel, which is a part of that Butler Fitzgerald tomb that I mentioned earlier. This is definitely Rory O'Tunney again. We've got these carvings that are still at St. Canice's as well, but these ones have been moved. So Edwin Ray published a journal in the OKR back in about 1970, I think, and suggested that this was all part of one tomb, and he might be right in that, and he suggested that it was also part of the Short Hall effigy in St. Canice's. And now, I have my doubts. I have my doubts that this actually is O'Tunney at all. I'm sorry to disappoint some certain people, but now the reason for questioning, I suppose, this is the Ormond school that you see also in St. Canice's. It seems to be more directly related to the Butler Fitzgerald tomb as well, which I think is a product of that school. You see it in Gorn, for example, as well. But it's by comparison to Rory O'Tunney, even though it's quite good sculpture, it's a lot more, it has a much smaller output compared to Rory. But it's still an interesting, this is well worth a study at some point as well in its own right. It needs a much closer look to see, to explain what's going on with these tombs. Is this even an O'Tunney, for example? Is it another member of the family or somebody else entirely? We don't know. They're never signed, unfortunately. So that's why they're simply called the Ormond group. But this effigy, Edwin Ray suggested was the effigy that sat on top of all of these and formed a big box tomb. But these are definitely Rory O'Tunney. I'm not so sure about this, to be honest with you. And if there is an O'Tunney connection, it's the secondary inscription that we see here, not to James Shortall, but actually to his wife, Catherine White. And that, I think, is carved by William O'Tunney, who will be the subject perhaps for another night, but I won't be talking about William O'Tunney particularly tonight. But this is the only O'Tunney connection I can see on this particular effigy. And it's based on the script, is very, very close to William O'Tunney's script. But I'm willing to be wrong about this. I'd be quite happy to be wrong about this, in fact, but I just have my doubts about it. Even though the carving is somewhat similar, there are more than subtle differences with some of the other effigies that we see, and the script is completely wrong. And then we've got other complete jigsaw pieces that have been just put together, unfortunately, a bit randomly at the Rock of Cashel as well. And it's very difficult to say anything more about this other than it's another example of Rory O'Tunney's work. But another example, slightly closer to home now, is a Grangefertagh. And this is an interesting one because it also seems to be in situ, or it may have been moved a little bit, but I think it was always in this chapel where it is today. And it may not have moved at all, in fact. It's possible that it's entirely intact. So, an effigy to one of the Fitzpatricks and his wife. Obviously, close allies with the Ormonds, and I don't really have time to go into the historical connections here because that is nearly subject for another night and it still needs a bit of exploration. But when we talk about the connections between Rory O'Tunney and the Butlers, I think we have to be careful because I don't think it's necessarily a connection with all Butlers. It may be a very specific connection to Butlers and their very, very close allies. And I'm thinking in particular actually of Piers Butler, the Earl of Ormond. But I think that needs a bit more explanation. But there definitely seems to be connections between some of these families. The Cantwells, the Fitzpatricks, possibly the O'Moores, some of these Gaelic families, plus the kind of the local Old English families and the Butlers themselves. They all seem to be very, very closely connected in some way. And some of it, of course, is through marriage and things like that, but there may be other connections as well. This is not signed, but it definitely is Rory O'Tunney, and it has some very interesting differences. Now, this is kind of the output in terms of effigies, and particularly the male effigies. I've excluded a couple of females there, certainly the Fitzpatrick one. I've even thrown in Mr. Shortall, James Shortall for good measure, just to show you. Just for the sake of argument, we might just include him for the moment. But I have sincere doubts that this is actually Rory O'Tunney, but all the others do seem to be. Although I think there is still a question mark about the O'Moore one at Abbey Leaks. But that's for another day. So, in fact, when we think of Rory O'Tunney's output, his carvings of effigies are quite small. We're not talking about, he didn't do a whole army of effigies. It's a relatively small number. Now, of course, we are missing some, and you can see how fragmentary this example is. And there may have been others. One of the difficulties, actually, is trying to trace nice little connections that link them all very closely together. Because Rory is good. He knows what he's doing. He's not, the effigies of these knights in particular, whether it's a Butler or whether it's a Cantwell or Walsh or whoever it might be, they all want to be treated differently. They don't want to look like the same as the person. These are individual portraits, so they're going to look for subtle differences. But the connections, in fact, are not with the knights or the effigies or the ladies for that matter, because they're individuals. It's more to do with some of these figures, and particularly the crucifixion, because that's the one thing that links nearly all of these together are the crucifixion scenes and how they're treated. The shape of the cross, the figures involved, particularly the figure of Christ, how it's depicted, the loincloth almost like wings falling out. And then also these little floral motifs at the top, which we see hints of elsewhere as well. And then we have this very fine from Callan in the Catholic Church today, but originally from St. Mary's, the Trinity, which I suppose kind of forms part of the crucifixion theme, if you like, in a sense, in that it's not one of the apostle scenes, of course. It has this very interesting little kind of almost daisy wheel effect on the head of God. And no doubt, there's question marks here then what is the influence? Where does Rory O'Tunney get his inspiration from? That's potentially a whole other subject, and I don't have full answers to that. But I think you can see that in the alabaster here, which is from the Black Abbey, for example. I can see definitely some interesting comparisons between, say, the Rice Monument in Waterford Cathedral and some of O'Tunney's work. So there are probably some very local inspirations as well that he's getting. And then there's also a question, which I don't have time to go into tonight, really, about his legacy. How did he influence later generations of stonecutters? Ones that may have worked with him as an apprentice, for example, or others who may have just seen his work, maybe never met the man, but saw his work and were inspired by him. Those type of questions would be interesting to look at in as a fallout from this as well at some point. Looking at all the apostle scenes that we get here today and kind of invoking people to make a prayer in the Apostles' Creed and so on. And, the people who are buried here will benefit from us. We don't anymore. But, generations would have passed by these tombs and said prayers. And, of course, they would have benefited from it at the time, presumably, in heaven, of course. They're in heaven. I don't know why they need more prayers, but it's the people who are still on earth who presumably still need, the ones in urgent need of prayer, if you're into that. So this is kind of looking at the broad assemblage of O'Tunney's carvings, and you can, I think it's a little bit early to kind of put a sequence to showing what his earliest works look like compared to, say, somewhere in the middle of his career to, say, somewhere towards the end of his career. And, where exactly we're talking about, we do have difficulty with some of the dates appearing on them. Some of them are very early. I've no doubt that some of the dates on some of the tombs are much too early to be Rory's, the actual date. So there's a question mark about those. I think the period that we're talking about really is the 1530s and 40s and thereabouts, which is maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit later. But if you think of the 1530s and 1540s, what's happening during that period? Well, it's the bloomin' Reformation, isn't it? There's abbeys closing all over the place, and churches kind of obviously struggling with the whole Reformation as well, and local families reacting to it. Rory O'Tunney is in the middle of all of this, carving monuments for families, but he's also in the middle of a building boom, which I'll come back to. So it's a really interesting period, from, if you like, that Reformation period, to see how not just Rory's involvement in this in terms of his own carvings, but obviously the families who are commissioning him are deeply involved in this, and they're expressing their own religious beliefs. And a lot of this seems to be more or less a kind of a counter-Reformation, even in the build-up to the Reformation, and in the immediate aftermath of the Reformation, is to stand to say, no, we're not having that locally. And we know that kind of continued for a few decades to come after, if not a whole century. And so to looking at some of the ends, now you can see almost exclusively we have St. Peter at one end, we have St. Andrew, and then St. James is usually following. And it's interesting then to see these panels where they're end panels. So we're getting the three key figures that nearly always appear at the start of the sequence. are appearing by themselves here as three. So this is telling us somehow the arrangement of these tombs within the church. And today they're always rearranged wrong. Every single time they're rearranged incorrectly. But if we read these carefully, we can see maybe how they were supposed to be presented originally in the church. Because the figure of St. Peter is meant to be seen first. And that's how we're supposed to read it. So that's why when we see our friend here in Kilcooley, St. Peter is tucked in the corner, that's definitely the wrong place. He should not be there. He should be in a different position, presumably on the opposite side of the church where the Butler tomb is today. And even just, so looking at St. James the Major, the Pilgrim, obviously very popular saint, a lot of pilgrimage to Compostela, of course. Maybe one of the reasons why he's consistently depicted here. So that's why I use him as an example, just to show the variety of carvings. Now, there's a lot of similarities there, but you can see that he never carves it the same twice. There might be some bit of similarity sometimes, but it very often is more than a subtle difference, you could say. And I think that's, you could easily read that and say, well, is it even by the same person? But why not? He's not going to carve this. He's skilled at what he does. He doesn't need to kind of just think blinkers on. This is what St. James looks like. I'm just going to do it that way again. He's going to do it a little bit different, because like he's a true artist. And same if we look at St. Philip as well. Just picking out two of the key apostles here. The floral motifs are extremely important, and we've just got a glimpse of some of those on those crucifixion panels. But we frequently, so here's the Grace tomb here in St. Canice's, the Butler tomb in Kilcooley, and you can see these little motifs sometimes appearing on the altar tops as well, just kind of casually there almost. They're not ubiquitous. We don't find them universally or anything like that, but they do appear from time to time. And I think when certainly some of the later sculptors did copy this idea. But he does have a particular way of treating this floral motif that I think is distinctively Rory. But it's his vine leaf, if you like, that is the one that's key. And he basically has two forms, and you can see this little floral effect here as well, more of a kind of and here too, kind of somewhere in between. Sometimes what you might say is a rose motif or a daisy motif. It's hard to discriminate sometimes. But it's the vine leaf here and here and here that we see. And the one that kind of jumps out very clearly are these ones, which I think Colleen described as having little dimples, and which is a good description for it, in fact. But also so this is kind of a more mature leaf that's kind of, summer leaf that's out in flower, not in flower, but in kind of full foliage, summer foliage. Whereas the motifs that we're seeing here is still kind of that early kind of, or late spring foliage that they might see on a vine. If you're lucky enough to be walking vineyards in spring. So we're kind of getting this idea, it may be telling us something about that whole, because it is supposed to be a motif for Christ as well. Is this a kind of a youthful Christ and a kind of a Christ more mature towards, closer to the crucifixion and so on. But there is, now, both of these types, if you like, the kind of the young and the older leaf are something that you will see, quite commonly around the country. It's not just particularly Rory O'Tunney by any means. But he does have a very particular way of showing the mature leaf with those dimples, something that you occasionally see elsewhere, copied, possibly. And then this motif here, I think it kind of has to me like this kind of, it's almost like these are the ears of a sleeping dog or maybe a pig or something like that, just kind of flapped down as it's asleep. And this is the snout. Whether it's a dog or a pig or whatever, you can make up your own mind. But but it's a particular way of doing it. Again, you will see this kind of copied and examples of this elsewhere, but it's a very specific carving of that he uses, and it's very consistent. So he might do other things differently, like the figures will be all different. Some of those kind of rose and daisy motifs are always a little bit different. But the vine leaf is very consistent. That's the one thing he is consistent about, always. And this is important because this, in fact, is a signature motif in its own right. Not that, I mean, the motif isn't, but it's the way he does it is what's important. And this is what we can trace in the architecture. So it becomes important very shortly, as we'll see. But we can see that interest in architecture quite clearly here in Kilcooley, and particularly on the Fitzpatrick tomb at Grangefertagh. And some people have kind of thought, well, you know, he's obviously inspired by some of the architecture he sees, and quoting examples of some of this architecture that he saw, and he transposed that into kind of a more two-dimensional effect on a tomb like this. But I think it's more than that. I think he actually is responsible for some of the things that we see here, the actual windows and things, he's actually responsible for as well, as we'll see. These are very interesting examples of a more two-dimensional, it's almost like a technical drawing of a window. In this case, this is be the rib vaulting of a crossing tower, the ceiling, other motifs, all architectural motifs here really. I think if you look even at the way he creates the niches for all the figures and so on, there's a very architectural flair to those as well. So here is Grangefertagh, and here is an example in Callan. And I've often heard people say that this is an O'Tunney, part of an O'Tunney tomb or carving. But actually, if you look at this, I don't think it's the same person. I don't think this is Rory O'Tunney, actually, even though it's very, very similar. I think it's an ode to O'Tunney, carved by somebody who saw his work and thought they were going to try to do the same thing. But there are more than subtle differences in the way that O'Tunney does it. His is very, very flat. This is and quite broad kind of members here. It just doesn't have the same quality to it, I think. Whereas this also is in Callan. It's just a fragment of something else. And this is definitely O'Tunney. But I don't think this one is, even though it's often cited as being an example of Rory's work. But we do know that Rory O'Tunney is working at Callan, because here we have a fragment of something much bigger that's now missing the rest of it. I'm going to come back to Callan later. But when I see Grangefertagh, and then I look at this here in St. Mary's, I think this is O'Tunney. And when you look at this end, which is the end here of this particular piece, and you can see the resemblance there, this is O'Tunney. And then you see the same motif at Callan. This is not the same person, just to demonstrate that. But here we now have another piece by Rory O'Tunney here in St. Mary's. And I'm going to go back to Callan now, as you can see. I mean, one of the interesting things about Rory O'Tunney is that not just do we have a name for a sculpture. If you go up and down the countryside, you will see medieval buildings all over the place. But who made them? Who were the stonemasons involved? You know, the master builders, the people who carved some of the fine windows and doorways. We actually don't know. There are very, very few historical records that even can shed light on this. The only example I know of a stonemason who has carved his name anywhere else in the country is a guy called John. And his name appears on a window in Portumna Friary, or Priory, and also the Augustinian Priory of St. Mary's in Clontuskert. It seems to be the same John. There's also another John who put his name on the high altar in Sligo Abbey, the Dominican Priory in Sligo. So, and it was a different John, by the way. So all these sculptors seem to be called John, but we don't have a surname for them. In fact, and literally compared to, say, the UK, in particular England, and many other parts of the continent where you have very good records, we could look at 16th century work and we can say exactly who carved it and where they moved or where they trained and so on. We don't have that here in Ireland. But that's why Rory O'Tunney is so important, because finally, believe it or not, there is not just a first name, but a second name, Rory O'Tunney, that we can ascribe to buildings in 16th century Ireland. And this is why it's important, because we cannot do that anywhere else. We cannot trace any architect as well, actually, as we can Rory O'Tunney here in Kilkenny and Tipperary especially. So, here's Callan. I'm just using this as an example of a medieval building, what we might otherwise just be looking at it without being able to put a name to who the builder is. I'm going to come back to it. Start with what you know. So here we have Tullaroan. And we can see very clearly O'Tunney's work on the doorway. We have, and it's not just any person who's responsible for this doorway. It's John Grace and his wife, Noreen Brannock, really Walsh, I suppose, who have the tomb in St. Canice's. Now, I have a funny feeling, I wouldn't be surprised at all if our tomb was originally situated here rather than St. Canice's. I'm just putting it out there as a possibility. I don't know that for a fact, obviously, but I wouldn't be surprised if it originally was situated in this chapel. So the Grace Chapel, or the Grace Brannock Chapel at Tullaroan, it has a date on it. Now, this carving here, which commemorates John Grace, I've no doubt is carved by O'Tunney, the inscription, but the second piece that's inserted here, which actually gives the date of 1541, I think it is, or thereabouts, and his wife's name, I'm not so sure that's actually O'Tunney's script. It might be inserted later. But this doorway, the Grace line here above the doorway, the vine leaf motif, this is the meatloaf. The vine leaf motif at Grangefertagh, on the tomb at Grangefertagh. So we've got tomb, doorway here, and on the doorway here. This is definitely carved by O'Tunney. Now, you could look at that and say, that's great, we've got a doorway carved by O'Tunney. But it's not just the doorway, it's the whole bloomin' chapel is created by O'Tunney. That's the point. If you look at the south window of the chapel, this is actually carved by O'Tunney as well. Very distinctive, the vine leaf motif here. But also, and I don't really have time to go into kind of the really granular implications here, but when you look at the tooling as well, I will come back to it a little bit, that's involved. Here we have the Fitzpatrick tomb in its original chapel at Grangefertagh. And I think I wouldn't be surprised at all if our Grace, so the Fitzpatrick tomb is right here in this chapel here. That's the main church, which is now, was for a long time a handball alley, which isn't anymore, I don't think. But it still looks like a handball alley, that's the problem. Here it is, sitting inside there in its original location, and I think the Grace Monument that's in St. Canice may have occupied a similar location in the chapel at Tullaroan. At least it may have been intended to. Whether it actually ended up there or not is a different matter. Things, events can change and maybe it was finally put together in St. Canice and it's been there for a long time, perhaps. What's interesting, though, about Grangefertagh, by comparison, though, is while the tomb it still is in its original location, everything that was surrounding that tomb has been scattered, not quite to the four winds, but it's kind of scattered and landed in Johnstown. The Catholic Church, because they couldn't be outdone by their Protestant neighbours, decided to move the window, and I'll come back to that if you don't know the story already. So they've got the window. This is actually the window of the chapel itself. What would be the north window of the chapel, which is, that window would in fact be here. We're also missing a window here. That would be the east window of the church. But the north window of the chapel is this one. And this is the Fitzpatrick tomb itself. Has the exact same window shape that you see up here. And look at that. There's Rory O'Tunney's vine leaf. Exactly the same. So he's carved the window. He's carved the tomb. He's actually built the whole damn chapel. It's not just that he carved the tomb. He's built everything that you see around it. And, in fact, he's probably responsible for a major upgrade of the church itself. So the church, that east window is taken around 1799 and brought to the Church of Ireland, where you can see it today as the east window. And there's a very interesting style of window that we'll see again. There's his vine leaf, a close-up of it, and we're getting both examples, the dimpled version and this kind of other version here, the sleeping pigs, or whatever we'll call it that. Sleeping dogs. Yeah. Sounds better, doesn't it? But also the doorway. And the doorway here is extremely similar to what we've seen in Tullaroan. And here we see it has been commandeered and used as the west doorway of the Church of Ireland. And the date 1799 very conveniently helps us to tell us when that took place. But here's a doorway, definitely carved by O'Tunney. It probably is the doorway of the church rather than the chapel, but maybe the chapel did have its own doorway as possible. It's hard to figure out exactly where this was originally located within Grangefertagh Church. And the reason why, of course, this is so interesting is because it feeds in, or it is directly comparable to another doorway much closer to us here. And that's the one on the boundary of St. Canice's graveyard, on the Bishop's Palace side. Now, this doorway is not in its original location. Most of it is the original doorway, except the arch here is actually a later stone that's been used. But otherwise, most of the carvings here are original. Except it's not in its original location. It's been moved here, as I say, probably in the 18th century. It's probably during Bishop Pocock's time, when he seems to have created a nice little kind of neoclassical avenue or arcade for himself to walk through from the Bishop's Palace as he walked into the church through the north doorway into the north transept. And all that's gone, but what we're left with is the doorway that provided access between the palace and St. Canice's itself. The question is, where did this doorway come from? I don't really have an answer to that. I'm kind of putting it out there. It'd be interesting to see what theories people have, because there's nowhere obvious in St. Canice's today where it could come from. Now, we could well be, I think we are, missing important parts of the church, particularly on the north side of the cathedral. We are missing important elements there. Could this be a doorway into for example, a chantry chapel on the north side of the church that we just don't know exactly where it was because it was demolished 17th, 18th century or something like that? Interesting possibilities. Or could it come from somewhere else entirely? Could it come from, because it's not a stone's throw either, from the Franciscan Priory or the Dominican Abbey, could it come from one of those houses after the dissolution? And a lot of those buildings, as we know, were demolished and substantially altered as well after the dissolution. So could this doorway not actually be associated with St. Canice's at all, but have come from somewhere else in Kilkenny? I'm just putting that possibility out there because, well, I suppose it's easy to put that possibility out there when we really don't know, and it's going to be very difficult to prove one theory right or wrong anyhow. So now we have at least, that's 3 doorways that we can attribute to Rory O'Tunney. And it's not just the carvings, if you like, on the top that connect these. When you look at the mouldings, in particular, say the way that the bottom of the door jambs are done, all 3 are identical. So there's no question that these are definitely carved by the same person, and it has Rory O'Tunney's fingerprints all over it. And as I said, it's not just about a doorway or a window. The implication is, in those examples that I've given you there for the Fitzpatrick Chapel at Grangefertagh, for the Grace Chapel at Tullaroan, Rory O'Tunney basically built those chapels. But so far, we're just talking about chapels. Heywood. There's a curious, of course, folly in Heywood, and nobody seems to exactly know where these come from, how they come to be at Heywood. There's an interesting bit of detective work to say, why are they here at all, where they are? Now, somebody goes, oh yeah, Abo. They're not from Ahabo. I know Carrick said they might be from Ahabo, which then everybody took to mean that they were from Ahabo. All he said was that they might be from Ahabo. He didn't actually say that because nobody knows. And I can guarantee you they're not from Ahabo. And I've looked at Ahabo very, very closely to see, apart from the fact that these windows would not fit in Ahabo, the windows that do survive them, the partial remains, are actually not by Rory O'Tunney. I would love to say Rory O'Tunney was working at Ahabo, but he wasn't, unfortunately, from what I can see. It's actually carved by somebody else, even though there's a lot of similarities with some of the windows. But this, so we've got 2 windows here at Heywood. Where have they come from? I don't know why Carrick said Ahabo, which is actually quite a distance from there, when he overlooked Abbey Leaks, which is just a stone's throw from here. And of course, where did Abbey Leaks Abbey go? The Cistercian Abbey. We don't know. It's gone practically, apart from an effigy tomb, possibly by Rory O'Tunney, and he may have been at work. This may be one of his carvings, more of evidence of him working at Abbey Leaks, but it's very difficult to prove where these windows came from. Could they be closer to somewhere at Haywood? I have a sneaking suspicion actually they're from Abbey Leaks, but it's going to be difficult to prove that one way or another. And maybe they are from a site much closer to Haywood itself. Anyhow, enough about that. The windows. I'm still a little bit puzzled as to this window because now most of this is definitely original. The head isn't, and a lot of the mullions here are not original either. I need to do a bit of more detective work on that one. But this window here, the smaller one of the two, which is the one here, kind of more in the shade, I'm convinced is Rory O'Tunney. And the reason for that is looking now granularly at the carving, at how the window is carved. And what we're left with, the particular type of tooling that we see, and also even this little incised line that you can see on the mullions as well, or some of the tracery rather, that you see here. You can see it. This is the window that's now in Johnstown that's originally from Grangefertagh. If this is Rory O'Tunney, this is also Rory O'Tunney, because it has exactly the same treatment. So far, we've looked at chapels, and I'm going to give you another example of a chapel, but on a slightly grander scale. Kilcooley, where the very first slide was of tonight, we talked about, there's 3 Rory O'Tunney tombs signed at Kilcooley, and there might be 1 or 2 others that are by him as well that aren't signed. But anyway, Kilcooley is famous for a lot of very fancy sculpture, including this dividing screen wall that is kind of dividing the south transept from the sacristy. Very fancy. Nothing else like it in Ireland. Very high quality. I'd love to say this is Rory O'Tunney because I looked at it for a long time, and but it was like trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole, because it's not. And Kilcooley, during there's a bad fire there in the mid-15th century, and there's a lot of investment, particularly by the Butlers, as you can see here. We've got the Butler coat of arms on this screen, and there's also other elements in the Abbey that have the Butler coat of arms. So the Butlers are heavily involved, and presumably other families as well, in redeveloping and refurbishing the Abbey. Now, they also reduced it in size because they took out the north aisle here and made the nave itself smaller. But they spent a lot of money in the chancel and the south transept in particular. The south transept is probably where the Butlers are because that's the nearest one to the screen wall that we see here. But what about the north transept? This window, I'd love to say this is Rory O'Tunney, but it's not. It's definitely carved by a different person. And Rory O'Tunney is obviously impressed by it because he refers to it in at least in a couple of instances on his tombs with that pattern. But what has gone unnoticed is that the very northernmost chapel is different to all the others. And it's not 15th century in date. It's 16th century in date. This window that you see here. So if you enter Kilcooley Abbey today or tomorrow, you come in this side and you walk past through and you're immediately drawn into the church itself to look at all those nice carvings, and you don't realise that you've actually walked past Rory O'Tunney's work. Because it's largely collapsed. It's the least well preserved, unfortunately, of all the chapels there. Because the ceiling has mostly collapsed, as you can see here, because it's open. But that window is definitely Rory O'Tunney. Here's the Grangefertagh tomb. There's the window, slightly different. But if we look again at the detail of the tooling, as much as anything, it's definitely Rory O'Tunney. Now, unfortunately, you see, one of the reasons maybe for people not noticing this before is because we don't have any of those nice vine leaf motifs that we saw earlier, kind of flanking either side of the window. So the kind of the obvious flags of Rory O'Tunney are not there until you look at it very, very closely and you look almost granularly at, I've used that word a few times, at the actual chisels that were used. That's when it jumps out as being Rory O'Tunney. Especially on the inside, when you look at some of the columns here that divide it from the other chapel that's there, and the inside of the window. This is without doubt Rory O'Tunney's chapel. Now, if the Butler tomb that we saw earlier at Kilcooley was closer to the Butler South Chapel, transept rather, then maybe the Cantwells, and there's 2 Cantwell tombs here in Kilcooley, are responsible for this chapel. Just putting it out there as a possibility. It's going to be a hard one to prove again. But if this chapel is carved by and produced by O'Tunney, it must be associated with some of the tombs in Kilcooley. I think the Butlers are probably on the south transept, and this is more likely the Cantwell side. Bringing it back closer to Kilkenny itself, and Callan, and closer to Mallard's Town, as he's supposedly where his workshop is. The Augustinian Friary is an interesting site in itself, and partly because the history of the site, it obviously has Butler connections. It's an Augustinian Friary. It's not an abbey or a priory. It's an observant order of the Augustinians, and they're actually not so much associated with this part of the country in Leinster. They're very much associated with the West, and you can see that in terms of the historical connections here, and some of the friars here are O'Malley's and people like this from the west of Ireland. And this is why Callan Friary actually really needs to be looked at closely, because there could be, you've got one of the finest Sedilius, isn't it? And Pesquina as well, right beside it, in the chancel here. It's one of the finest in the country. And it's kind of a bit of an oddity, and you kind of think, well, could the O'Malleys and people like this, it's not just the O'Malleys, there's others from the west as well, have brought some of their sculptors with them to Callan? I'm not saying that Rory O'Tunney was one of them, but something like that could be happening here. There's an odd history to the site. The whole West End seems to have been rebuilt at some point. There was a transept here which was removed when they put the tower in, and then you had another transept built here. You've got new windows inserted. The east windows are a replacement as well. There's a lot of different phases here that haven't really been fully teased out, at least in my head, whatever about anybody else's head. But for the time being, I do have a question mark about some of these windows as being Rory O'Tunney. But I think we have another chapel here, a north chapel coming off the nave that was built by Rory O'Tunney, even though it doesn't survive. And that's purely by looking at the stonework involved in the arch. The chapel was out there towards the house that you see in the background. It's gone now. But we do obviously have the arch itself and some of the cones here that are supporting the arch. It's the treatment of that which makes me think this could have been another O'Tunney chapel. Staying in Callan, we have St. Mary's Church itself. So we have the West Tower, which is one of the oldest parts of the church. We have the nave, which has a north aisle, the central part of the nave, the south aisle. Chancel, that was still in use as Church of Ireland Church until the 1970s, and a sacristy here. In fact, this was a cruciform chancel. It also had another wing out here where this yew tree is, but that's actually gone now, but you can still see the scar of it on the north side of the church. It's very obvious. So it basically had a cruciform shape here as well. Highly unusual. So this chancel was here before this was built, and the tower was here as well. So tower, chancel, and then a later nave. So we can see Rory O'Tunney's handiwork in the chancel itself. I'm not saying he built the chancel. In fact, he didn't. The chancel was already there when he arrived. The sacristy is built by somebody else. Maybe one of Rory O'Tunney's sons, possibly, or somebody else. But it's not Rory O'Tunney. But that window that you see there, I think is Rory O'Tunney. And the Pesquina on the inside, because it has similar mouldings to the doorways we've just looked at, is also Rory O'Tunney. So he's been involved in refurbishing the chancel of St. Mary's in Callan. We can go one further. Now we can say he wasn't just refurbishing churches or building the odd chapel here and there. I think he actually rebuilt the whole nave. So this was already here. He put in a new window. I mean, he might have actually put in a couple of new windows. He put in a new Pesquina in there. That tower was already here. But that nave, and somebody said a few years back, I think it was probably Howard Least, that this was built in the 1450s. And because he said it, it must be true Therefore, everybody has ever since said it was built in the 1450s. So nobody for a second thought that anybody working in the 16th century like Rory O'Tunney could be involved in that nave, because it was built in the 1450s. He wasn't even born then. Never believe what you read when people put down dates, because there is no date on this nave. There's no, this was built in 1450. Nothing. There's only one church I can think of that actually has that date, and even that's questionable. And that happens to be in Lough Erne on Devonish Island, which also happens to have a doorway very similar to Rory O'Tunney's doorways. But anyway, that's for another night, because I don't exactly know what the connection is there, but there might be one. This nave was not built in the 1450s. It was more likely built in the 1540s, nearly 90 years later after allegedly built. And the person who built this nave, both aisles of the central aisle, is Rory O'Tunney. Without doubt, this is Rory O'Tunney. So he's actually building now on a big scale. Now, I should say he's not the only one obviously building these, but we'll come back to that. We can see it very clearly in this east window. This is the east window of the south aisle. This is the central part, and this is going to be the north aisle. I'll talk about that shortly. But this is the south aisle here. And the main street is here. You come off, enter into the graveyard here. And there's a south door there. What's interesting about this window here is the switchline tracery. It is, in my mind, this is an O'Tunney work, the window. But it's not just the window. It's actually the whole nave is built by him. And you know, when you look at all the details, it's not just about looking at the windows, it's about looking at everything. Everything from the coin stones on the corner to the string course that you see at the bottom, that goes all the way around the nave, by the way, is carved by O'Tunney. This is a real West of Ireland window. It's actually not what you see in Leinster at all. And I think this style of window is what threw people like Harold Leese into thinking this was a mid-15th century window, but it's not. And when we look at the other windows here, all again, Rory O'Tunney, it becomes more obvious when we look at this particular window here, which is the one closest to the doorway. Same vine leaf motif again. The doorway itself, and you know, I kind of wonder why we're getting a lion here, but I don't think there's necessarily a grace connection here, but it's interesting because obviously we have the grace lions carved by O'Tunney in St. Canice's and Tullaroan. But when you look closely at the mouldings on the doorway, it's consistent with what we've already seen. It's exactly the same what we've seen in Grangefertagh, well, Johnstown now, at Tullaroan, and here at St. Canice's. And looking at the lion and the vine leaf motifs again, Rory O'Tunney, without question. The angels. Edwin Ray actually, in his article on Rory O'Tunney, pointed out about the kind of the carving of the hair, and suggested it was very similar to what O'Tunney was doing, and he seemed to think obviously that Rory O'Tunney was inspired by what he saw at Callan. I'm not sure. Maybe he did think there was more of a connection, but he's a little bit vague as to what that connection might be, and almost gives the impression that he thought that Rory O'Tunney saw this and was inspired by it. But maybe, I'm going to give him a bit of credit, he might have realised, but I don't know this, but he might have realised that actually the reason why there's similarities is because it's carved by the same man. It's Rory O'Tunney himself. So that was the south doorway here, the south aisle, the interesting arcade here, and there's the north arcade, which is slightly similar, and then we've got the north aisle. And this is one that actually to me is stunning because of the window. Again, a highly unusual window. Has more of a West of Ireland feel to it, to me, funny enough. But on the inside, you've got the Pasquina here, you've got a statue shelf here, you've got the main altar, and then you've got a little predella or steps up to a little small altar there. Could this be where the nice Holy Trinity that we saw that's in the Catholic Church, was that standing here? Or maybe it could be another religious sculpture as well. More than likely it was O'Tunney's work. The north doorway, the two little angels that we see here on either side, but also, and there's the figure of a lady here on the top, kind of a little bit unsure as to why, what this figure is doing here. Is it supposed to be Our Lady? Perhaps. I'm not sure about that necessarily, but what we do have interesting here is the remains of the pelican feeding its young. The head of the pelican, unfortunately, is missing, but you can see the young chicks here in the nest. And that, of course, is evoking the whole idea of the sacrifice of Christ. Looking at the arcades themselves, this is the more fanciful southern arcade, I think, isn't it? And then this is the north arcade there. And when you look closely at the tooling on this, it's definitely O'Tunney again. There's no question about it when you see the rest of his work. But I do concede that when you look closely at the pillar here, for example, this is one of the columns of the arcade. If you look closely at this, you can see that there's more than one hand involved here. Because, of course, Rory O'Tunney is not capable as one person. I know he's Superman and all that, but he can't possibly build a whole church like this or this part of the church on this scale as one person. There's a whole team of people involved here. I suppose there is a legitimate question to be asked, funny enough, I had lunch with Ben Murta earlier and he was talking about this with, I know most of you probably know Ben, and he kind of said, well, Rory O'Tunney's, he could be just brought in to do the fancy bits and then walks away, job done, I've done my bit and leaves the rest of them to it. And I suppose that, that's worth thinking about. Is he just brought in to carve a nice window, but then the kind of the hard graft of doing all the building work is left to somebody else? I don't think so. I don't think so because of it's not just a case here of building a nice window. There's so many different elements that have gone into this. It's not just about putting in a nice doorway and a few nice windows. The whole arcade has his fingerprints all over it. So I think he's not just a sculptor, he's also a master builder. He's at the heart of building something like this. But when you look at some of the stonework here, you can see different tools and probably then different hands involved. At least 3 different people who are doing a lot of the hard work as well. But I think the person who's directing them behind the scenes is Rory O'Tunney. And again, you can even see it when you look at and this is exactly the same type of column and cone shape here to the arch that we saw in Kilcooley in the chapel, believe it or not. It's exactly the same. And the dressing on the stone is exactly the same as well, because they're using those exact same tools. Now, a stonecutter in this period, and at a glance, if you look at it at a glance, it all looks the same. But then if you look at a whole series of fingerprints on a blank, whatever, they all kind of look the same until you look at it closely and you realize, actually, no, they're all different. And it's the same with the techniques that the stonecutters use on the stones. The chisels are always going to be slightly different. Now, a stonecutter's chisel is not going to last him a lifetime. He could be using several different chisels in his lifetime. But the style and his preference for a particular type of chisel is probably going to be the same. It might be slightly different when it comes to the finer details here, but the column itself might be treated differently, of course, because it could be rendered. You could have a nice finish on it like this, so you wouldn't see the stone necessarily any of the, this is whitewash, but if you put a plaster on that before whitewashing it, you're not going to see any of the stone cutting, the dressing rather, but you will see some of this because it was meant to be seen. Now, so far we've looked at entirely ecclesiastical. So the question is, could O'Tunney be involved in secular commissions as well? And that's a question I have. And I'm going to give you one example where I can show that he is involved in secular commissions. But on what scale, I don't know yet. And this is potentially an interesting area to examine in the future. Ormond Castle, Butler connection once again. Now, of course, here we've got Thomas Butler's fancy manor house, ode to Queen Elizabeth, the southeast tower that you see here today. Now, this was not built by O'Tunney, but in that tower today is a carving by O'Tunney. But where exactly did it come from in the castle? Because it's not in its original location. It's been moved from somewhere else. It's probably been moved from, I think, a hall that was on the far side here, and not from within this tower, because we're obviously missing part of this tower, and we're missing a hall that was attached to that tower. And there's a nice the remains of an oriel window overlooking the garden on that side. And I think what we have in this tower today was originally part of that part of the building. And it's part of a window. But today it's not serving as a window, but it originally was part of a window. And when you look at the kind of this banner effect or banderole, this is what he uses on his tombs, and he carves an inscription on it. In this case, it wasn't carved. You can see it's blank, but I think it was originally painted and actually had painted lettering on it. It was designed to take lettering, although that lettering is now gone, unfortunately. When we look more closely at the two angels, and just take, for example, because nearly all of O'Tunney's figures are nice bearded saints, but an angel can't have a beard. You don't have to be nice, fresh-faced and shaven. And same with St. Michael here, who has the angel effect. This is the same carver, without doubt. This is Rory O'Tunney again, who's carved this window. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, oh, Granny Castle. Granny has a similar kind of window still in its original location. But I've looked at that, and I've looked at it upside down and inside out, and tried to convince myself it's Rory O'Tunney, but it's not. It's actually by a different person altogether, unfortunately. I'd love to say it is, but it's not. It might be by our friend from the Ormond School, believe it or not, which is a possibility, but it's not Rory O'Tunney. And even more closely, when we look at, this is the soffit of the window, it has, of the embrasure rather, not the window, but the embrasure of the window. It has this kind of like a garland effect of vine leaf, and it's identical to what we see here at Jerpoint, and it also has a little beastie at the end. So, a tantalising glimpse into the fact that Rory O'Tunney seems to be involved in secular commissions as well as all the church work that he's done. I'd love to find more. So if anybody has any suggestions of where to look, I'm guessing probably if it's a Grace Castle or a Cantwell Castle, it might be a good place to start as well, as of course as a Butler Castle here. And really on that note, I know I've really haven't even touched the surface on the historical connection here and the historical connections of the families, or even the kind of the religious element to a lot of the carvings and what they mean and how they would have been used. There's so many things we could have discussed here that I haven't really had time to, because really what I wanted to say was, this is not just a man who's out sculpting nice fancy tombs and effigies of knights and ladies. He's also out there building or rebuilding and refurbishing churches and abbeys all over Kilkenny and Tipperary. And I have my eye on a few other sites yet, and there's an odd glimpse of a carved stone here and there that makes me think that there are other examples to the ones I've just mentioned. But the one I think is probably most promising is in Feathered in Tipperary, which the Holy Trinity Church, but also the Augustinian Priory also has carving windows that look to me like they could be. I'm not saying that they are yet, but maybe if I want to get out there in the next couple of weeks and just confirm that in my mind. But I'm strongly suspect that he's involved here in Feathered as well. So this is the man who has left his mark on the churches in particular, but you can also see there might be other examples of castles perhaps as well, right throughout Kilkenny and Tipperary. And we've been able to trace him tonight through his sculpture, through his architecture, in a way that I don't think we've ever been able to do for any other sculptor or stonemason or builder from anywhere else in medieval Ireland. So thank you very much.